Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. My broadcast is titled World Watchers, and it is program number 691, March the 4th, 1985. I number these broadcasts and date them because the information that I use on the broadcast, the sources of it, is available if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I supply you with the way you can look into these materials yourself. They are, I agree, very controversial. Many of you are familiar with the fact that the FBI made a report on me in 1967. I've had it on the air a few times, but new listeners may not know it. It had to do with my being afraid of fascism. They stated that they had to form a file on me and begin following or whatever they do or whatever I write about. I wasn't writing in those days, but they sent messages to the State Department, Secret Service, and interdepartments to be aware of Mae Brussell because of two reasons. One, she's afraid of fascism, and two, because she even they said, stated it publicly. Well, today, this week, in the past week, I have seen more fascism in the press and in the news, and as Ronald Reagan said when he was elected, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's galloping along and very frightening, and I'll share some of those things that I saw and with you and try to interpret just what the implications are. They're pretty bad. I was going through the Freedom of Information file I have in my study to get that one report they did in 1967 and came across one sheet they returned to me, which I don't even remember ever seeing, dated December the 29th, 1972. And it has to do with the FBI, the acting director of the FBI, sending a message to San Francisco. Of course, that was J. Edgar Hoover in those days, regarding the conspiracy newsletter, an underground publication. And they wanted to find out if Paul Krasner and I had gotten out that newsletter yet. He was taking ads for it by December 72. My Watergate story came out in August of 72 in The Realist. So the FBI went to the publisher on Post Street of The Realist, and they didn't find anything like a conspiracy newsletter. And evidently they got in touch with Paul Krasner, and they said Krasner advised that the publication of the conspiracy newsletter has been delayed indefinitely. He advised that both he and Mae Brussell, who would be the editor of the publication, currently do not have time to work on it. In view of the above, the matter is being closed. However, the San Francisco FBI will remain alert for possible future publications of conspiracy newsletter. That was 13 years ago. I hope they're sitting on the edge of their chair. I wonder if they know that we switched from a newsletter to a radio program that's been on the air 14 years, when I was already on the air a year from 1971 when the FBI was looking for a newsletter in San Francisco. And I started on KLRB in those days and Hour News and have had ever since. And they were looking for a printed sheet while I was doing my radio time. NBC this morning, March the 4th, had a interview with Dr. Spock and a new co-author that's going to be working with him, Dr. Rothenberg, fairly middle-aged man. And he was talking about the new edition of his book. And he said when the first book came out, he put his feelings about atomic war and the politics of baby care in the middle of the book, and nobody paid attention to it. So now it's in the introduction or the beginning of the book. And he said something that I have known for a long time, and you younger people out there who have families should be aware of this, if you are not yet. He said parents have to be more political to take care of their kids. And that isn't just the formula and the diapers or thumb sucking or chicken pox and all those things or orthodonture. You have to be more political. And he said that he had sold 30 million books of his book on baby care. Can you imagine if 15 million mothers, forget the fathers, it's Women's Week this week, 15 million mothers had gone out and opposed the nuclear arms as they were building up. Now they are sent all over the world and ready to be shot off. They've been deployed to the proper places. 30 million books, and people put aside what Dr. Spock was saying about the politics. You can't separate. There's no way you can separate a child. Once you give birth to it, you can't separate its world from its body. You can take the best care of its body. You can't take care of that world as a thing that doesn't exist. It exists side by side. That's how I got into my work after I had 5 children and realized that all the things that they had, the lessons, the clothing, the education, the special schools, all the privileges, that wasn't enough. That I have to find out the milieu in which they were born and where their future or no future exists, and face it as it is, not as I want it to be, but as it is. And Dr. Spock's warning, if it had been heeded and people really cared about those children they gave birth to, simultaneously they would be working for peace and for no atomic bombs while they are raising these children. It's one thing to oppose the war in Vietnam, but when the war was over, the anti-political interest, it melted away and nobody cared. After Kent State, nobody cared. The bulk of the people that were out and visible about caring about their world faded into the landscape and now wear that insulting title of a yuppie. It's really a disgrace. Now, also on NBC News, and it was in the New York Times this week, I understand on Friday, is an article about George Bush going to the Sudan, accompanied by Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Whether you're aware of it or not, this is one of the gross separations of state being diminished totally. The Vice President of the United States should represent the USA, period. Pat Robertson, is the Christian broadcasting, is a very political animal. He got his start as a friend and maybe roommate at Yale with J. Peter Grace. Grace represents the Vatican, the Catholic Church, as a Knight of Malta, the head of the Knight of Malta in the United States. And he put up the know-how or the funds or encouragement for Pat Robertson. And Mr. Wyrick of the far right, also a strong Catholic, put up the money for Jerry Falwell's moral majority, the Vatican behind the two of them, and George Bush, a Catholic and a Knight of Malta. Now, just a few weeks ago, I talked about Prescott Bush, and I'm going to be doing more in a few more weeks on this subject. The story of the AmeriCares Foundation, that was a December 27th story, 1984, in the Chronicle and in the Washington Post. Prescott Bush with J. Peter Grace and their Knights of Malta going down to Central America, involved with the CIA, the Defense Department, acting as humanitarians with a capital H, and having been a part of military coups, overthrowing countries, using church as a guise. The links of Prescott are bad enough and shocking into a political arena where 40 and 50,000 people have been killed in those countries by death squads, 40,000 in Nicaragua, 50,000 in El Salvador, and having the vice president not going on official capacity to the Sudan. Now, what they do is he offers the government arms and military care to get themselves back on their bootstraps. A few weeks ago, the president took away the money from Sudan. Now he sends George Bush with the 2 religious leaders representing, literally starting with the Vatican, to the Sudan and saying, first we'll take it away, the carrot and stick, now we'll give it back, and then taking the masses, we'll build missionaries, turn you to Christians, feed you if you join the flock, and become good anti-communists, Christian anti-communists, which is a very much a part of the CIA manual. They're told that they're doing this for the Christian church, written in a country where there should be separation of state and church. And I'll do a little bit more on that Christian part of the manual. I have that manual, and a subscriber to the broadcast sent me an article in a publication emphasizing this point. So the separation of church and state completely melts away, and there are overt signs of the fascism that I was afraid of in '67 that are creeping along. Now, I mentioned before, I think I mentioned on the air, I don't remember, the book Eva Evita, The Life and Death of Evita Peron, and I'm going to be referring to it over and over again, and I've done past broadcasts on Eva Peron, her money, how she took this trip to Europe to the Vatican and Franco. She gets to France and has this mysterious disease and dies of cancer. Then her money is unleashed, the Nazi money that was put there, Vatican giving passports with the United States Army, not just the Vatican, the United States Army, to top Nazis, and Nazi gold and artifacts and diamonds, sold it into Swiss banks in her name. And then when she died in 1952, like a time bomb, that money is released to begin the World Nazi Movement, the resurgence of the Nazi movement. Now, in the book, Evita, the Life and Death of Evita Peron, it mentions after Eva died, Juan Perón turned to unparalleled lechery, spending $20 million of government funds, and I might have mentioned this before to you, on his own purposes and for youth groups that were not, of course, clearly defined. But in 1973, there were wild swings on the international gold market. There was speculation in the financial press of the liquidation of $800 million in Eva's illicit Swiss assets. And as I say, I'm going to bring this book up again, but I want to mention that briefly, because in the book, O Vatican, that just came out in 1984, written by Paul Hoffman, on page 251, he talks about a man who worked for German intelligence and also works for the CIA, Hans Langemann, and the allegations of the Vatican working with the CIA in spy rings in the 1950s or 1960s. Then he goes up to another period, and he says John Paul II's Secretary of State, Cardinal Casseroli, was particularly upset by the report in the West German magazine that had copies of documents that were taken from the Curia and that were made for Mr. Langemann on this point. And it said, they went on to say the espionage network that was presented in later years of this particular network that linked to the Vatican, that they referred to in the press, was called Operation Eva. And I wonder what this book is called, Eva Evita. And a lot of money was sprung in that time period. And I wonder if it went into the Christian broadcasting, all of them, all the main figures of the broadcasting, all of a sudden got unlimited time, unlimited money, unlimited funds for publications, unlimited colleges are starting. They have their own press reporters, the School of Journalism, so they can carry the news for the new order. They have their own medical schools and doctors who can do the autopsies and the medical care. The Christian colleges, in a time when this country didn't have such a great influx of profits from just being a Christian, where did they develop all that money? And George Bush, as director of the CIA, was flowing in like $18-20 billion of funds. And when Reagan became president, he said, I want to reactivate the role of the church and the priests as a cover and journalists for the intelligence community, which they've been doing all along through the World Council of Christian Churches and sanctuaries for assassins and gunmen. But it's very important to know that this same Christian broadcasting, and Mr. Roberts, who's down there in the Sudan with George Bush, was a big supporter in Guatemala of Rios Montt, the terrorist who was kicked out but who's very active. They've supported the death squads in El Salvador, and all the fascist regimes and the TV evangelists have become very important. Pat Robertson's 700 Club features Jeane Kirkpatrick, Senator Jeremiah Denton, Congressman Jerry Solomon, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is the darling of this group. Don't ever think, and they publish these little stories, that he might be a leftist. He is very much part of the entire TV evangelist Vatican network, and they are very political, Pat Robertson, if you watch them all the time. But when they leave the church and pulpit and accompany the vice president of the United States, who was the CIA director, then the government agencies can flow through the churches and down to lower levels and keep the death squads in power, which they seem to be doing, or opposing any changes or land reforms. And now the latest trip is into Africa. They've been there a long time, but it's just, for me, it's shocking to see George Bush traveling this way. The media had a lot of stories this past week that we've been carrying on World Watches for a long, long time. One, of course, was Reverend Gale. Newsweek had a large article about him, the Christian Defense League, and there was a 20-minute segment on NBC, and the Nazis and the Klan, and Reverend Gale not hiding what he's doing and warning about May Day coming. Be careful of May Day. The news has been filled with Joseph Mengele, and I've been trying for the past 2 years to smoke him out with certain links of where I was told he was and who he was dealing with. And, of course, the Mafia Roundup, and I'll do more on that maybe next week. Of the top 5 crime bosses that were pulled in, Roy Cohn represented one of the major families, one of the men that was arrested, and that was the Genovese. Remember the Genovese family, the head of it. And I have done many broadcasts on Raymond Donovan and his connections to Genovese and Jimmy Hoffa, and also Vito Genovese with Jack Ruby down in Dallas, and with the United States military in the same room, a general in the same room, and also on Roy Cohn being on the board of Western Goals with their computers into the police departments around the country of law-abiding citizens, feeding into their computers the attorney for one of the 5 big mafia chieftains in New York City that covers coast to coast and around the world where their traffic is involved, and having computers into the police department, and also being mentioned in the nomenclature of assassination cabal and his links to the people who killed John Kennedy. Many of the things that I've had for 14 years are coming to a head now and are interrelated. You can only do so much in an hour a week, but you can't help but notice them. Now, when I heard about the NBC show on the Christian Defense League, I wanted to call the person and tell them about Reverend Gale and his links to Clay Shaw and the Kennedy assassination. I called NBC New York and asked if I could have the news person who put that program on, and the woman who answered it said, "We didn't have that on the show this morning." And I said, "Yes, you did. A friend of mine saw it." And she says, paused a minute, when she said, "No, we didn't have anything about the Christian Defense League or the Nazis." I said, "A friend of mine taped the broadcast." Then she said, "Oh, yes, call Carol Marin in Chicago," and gave me a number, and nobody answered the number. But at NBC in New York, it didn't happen for all practical purposes. Now, I have the address for you of the Turner Diary. This is I've had on the air many times. This is the blueprint for the overthrow of the United States. It's the Mein Kampf of all of these various people who, again, link down to Joseph Mengele and to the various elements I've been talking about. The address for this book was published in a newsletter, a journal that I had got, in care of National Alliance Books. It was published in Soldier of Fortune magazine, which is worse, put out by Robert Brown, who I have linked and written about with his relationship to Reverend Gale and the Aryan Nations and the Christian Defense League. Turner Diaries, in care of National Alliance Books, Department S, Box 3535, Washington, D.C., 20007. If you didn't get that, you can write me a self-addressed stamp letter, P.O. Box 22351, 511, Carmel 93922. The National Alliance book. Now, in A Soldier of Fortune, it gives Andrew MacDonald, a nuclear physicist, as the author. The author was William Pierce, who worked at United Technology and had a defense contract from the Air Force for $37,000, and his name is not MacDonald. For some reason or other, they sanitized it. They made him a nuclear physicist, where the other one worked for the same company that Alexander Haig became president of a few years later, United Technology. And I don't suppose he just became president overnight. I suppose he had some contact. So the Reverend Gale, who was in the news fondly, has been identified, and you can always say you heard it first on World Watchers program or tape broadcast. His links to the Gale, to William Pierce, to Edgar Eugene Bradley, to Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan, and Clay Shaw and the murder of John Kennedy. I won't go over that for you. I have it on other broadcasts, but that is an important item that is finally getting some attention, not the connecting links. That's the part that we have to alert to public officials or journalists, that there are connections between these people. As a friend said to me the other day, in journalism you learn to do a single story. You're not supposed to make connections. Well, I break the rules and I make the connections. Now, regarding the Mengele link to the drug trafficking and the CIA documents that were in front page New York Times, and mentioning his being with Martin Bormann, that opened a whole can of worms because, as I mentioned before, the Simon Wiesenthal Center has said that they never could find Mengele or bring him in, or didn't know what he was doing, and that Bormann was dead. And I got a telephone call from one well-known author who got an offer for a book on Mengele, and he wanted me to send me my material on Mengele, and I told him what it was, but he's affiliated with the Wiesenthal Center, and I wouldn't send material there to them. Then another author who's well known called me this week. He wanted to know about Joseph Mengele, and I told him the very things I've had on this program for the past 2 years, and the links to DeLorean's money and to Martin Bormann in South America and the attorney and where the city where the money was deposited, and I ran that down, and this particular author was very excited. Somebody wanted to put up money for a book on these connections. He called me back later, and he was at the Wiesenthal Center, of course. And then the subject came up about how much they would do. And I don't want to work with those people for reasons I've told you. And I got an admission, I don't have to say the name of the person, that what they do, this is how Simon Wiesenthal works. This is sort of how like Mark Lane works, how they handle these big stories. Wiesenthal's offering $1 million to bring in Joseph Mengele. What they want to get their hands on Mengele, and like Klaus Barbie, they're willing to put him in a little room and isolate him so that you don't have access to him. But if you were ever to try him, you'd only bring in the people from Auschwitz that he affected. In other words, you narrow the investigation down, but you don't ask who got you out of Europe, who accompanied you out of Europe, although I have information how to locate one of the people that did now. But you only ask the question, did he torture people or kill people? Not how did you survive and who kept you company these past years. So the Wiesenthal Center wants $1 million. They've offered $1 million if you catch him. But if they get him, they can't ask the questions. So I prefer not to be affiliated in any way or to answer questions. But what I did do, not knowing that this first party, this author, was working with somebody who offered to put up money for a book. If he got the information, it's like pumping me for the names. I gave them the names, and they clinked. They made sense to them. There were certain names that they heard or knew, and they were going to pursue. But I assure you, it will be buried. It will not develop in the way that I've developed it for you on these broadcasts, and that's why it's so important to take these every week to learn how they cover up. If people had information on the assassination of John Kennedy, if they had anything that went off the grass, Mark Lane didn't want to know it. It was a grassy knoll. He used it and put it in his material or lectures. But outside that, you weren't supposed to know anything. I did mention that Reverend Moon was tied into Mr. Stroessner, General Stroessner, and the operation of Mengele down in South America. There's a story in the San Francisco Chronicle, February 18th, 1984. In Paraguay, the Moon Church has some access closely associating itself with the government of General Alfred Stroessner through one of the general's confidants, Juan Manuel Frutos, president of the Anti-Communist League, which is the World Anti-Communist League, which goes back to John Singlab and the Los Angeles Police Department, a lot of little areas that I'll be updating and making more clear for you later on. Now, in addition to that plane crash that left out of Paraguay to Bolivia, just when they were looking for Joseph Mengele, there was another plane crash February the 20th, 1985. 148 are killed as a Spanish jet hits the mountain. Now, the accounts of this crash were that the pilot didn't have access to a radio tower that he should have had. It wasn't on his map. And the New York Times has a story, King Juan Carlos and Prime Minister Felipe Gonzalez sent sympathy messages to relatives of the victims and also to the president of Hernan Siles Suazo of Bolivia. So there were admittedly 3 or more Bolivians on the airplane that crashed that got the condolences of the president of Spain and the prime minister of Spain. But what did they know if Mengele traveled back and forth, and also Klaus Barbie? What did they know, or could they know anything about the cocaine traffic that that's being exposed now? Because people are closing in now at various levels. There's a lot of good investigators who want to get a piece of this story, and they're not afraid to go into it. It's when you get to the top that the door is slammed and the lid is closed. But in the meantime, you can find a lot of little pieces if you look for them. There's nothing conclusive in that plane crash, but it seems strange at the time, the circumstances of it, and then the letter of condolences to Bolivia. Meanwhile, sitting in his jail in France, Klaus Barbie has been trying to arrange the seizure of power down in Bolivia. There's a story, August 11th, 1984, that Ted Rubenstein had sent to me from the Seattle Times. The Bolivian government presented two jailed Nazis at a news conference and said Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie had instructed them to organize paramilitary groups down there, the Nazis, and seize power. The suspects, Alvaro de Castro and Emilia Carboni, an Italian who's lived in Bolivia since 1978, didn't talk to journalists. They said that Mendez, they spoke to only in response to a question by Juan Mendez, the intelligence chief of the Interior Department, and they said they were instructed to help overthrow the current government because Klaus Barbie is instructing them from their jail cell. Now, just this past week, there was another front-page story of the New York Times. Barbie trial due this year, likely to be narrow in scope. Now, there you go again. He can't see anybody. Nobody can get to him. And they're going to put it down to what did he do to the children in the orphanage. They've warned you ahead of time. Nothing about what went on, from the time the war was over. He can't use that as his defense now. So he can't, his attorney was going to bring in the members of the resistance who worked with the Nazis. Now the judge has the right to reduce the scope of the trial to did he send the children to be killed, period, and that eliminates opening up a sore on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war by bringing in a lot of otherwise, in quotes, good people who were actually good Nazis. That is very important because in the so-called left or liberal circle that is around us all the time, there are always agents and double agents passing themselves off as friends, as informers working for this same echelon and appearing to be liberal. And when the truth is out on this about this country, since the 60s at least, going on up now till 1984 and beyond, 85, into this era, there are, maybe they've tripled or quadrupled the amount of agents that you assume that are working on your side but are doing everything to deflect the information from getting out. That doesn't mean you have to be paranoid. It has to be that you're aware of it. Now, the same day, there was a news story in San Francisco Chronicle, and a tiny one, that New York Times story, Klaus Barbie foils attempt to poison him. Accused Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie was given an acid substance instead of the regular medication in an apparent assassination attempt. He spat out the poison before swallowing it. He's in no danger. He's in an isolated cell. It was an acidic substance. It was not a medical mistake. It was an apparent assassination attempt. He's supposed to stand trial, and they're stalling this. Now, if there is this connection of Mengele and Barbie, and even going to the possibility that John DeLorean, they have to get those two Nazis off because DeLorean's out free, and you can cover up his bases or the connections. But what a horrendous story if there's a thread of truth in that connection, and I have reason to believe that there is. And even down, I understand the Wiesenthal Center names made sense, and they're doing a little bit of investigation. I don't know what they'll do. The New Times from the Soviet Union has a story, Barbie carries on, and it says even behind bars, 2 years have passed, he hasn't gone to trial, and now he's working with the neo-fascists down in Bolivia, and he's telling them to have a coup to get rid of the president of Bolivia, and giving instructions from his cell on how to overthrow the government that sent him for trial so that Bolivia can get back into the cocaine business, which is one of the main means of their support to wipe out the debt. And the Oregonian, December 25th, has a story, attorney of Klaus Barbie contends the aging Nazi will never be tried. They're working hard on this story, on keeping this story from getting out, and Mr. Verges, his attorney, doesn't think, according to this story, Jack Verg, Verges, it's pronounced, doesn't think he'll go to trial. He's been sitting on it. He's the one who wants to bring out the fact in his defense that he worked with all these other people, even at the time the orphans were killed, which is pertinent to the subject, actually, if he can bring it in, that he wasn't the only Nazi transporting them, but a lot of other people looked the other way or allowed it or were a part of it and were passing themselves off as the French resistance. Now, Richard Allen hosted a party down in Dallas, Texas at the time of the GOP convention. And among the guests that he had, he's starting an organization called International Republican Cooperation Fund. This is the former head of our National Security Council. He entertained the former president of Bolivia. And this article, one article I have, says that after overthrowing the democratically elected government of Bolivia in 1971, General Banzer ruled while the country was converted into the world's largest producer of cocaine paste. He was ousted in 1980. The president elected to succeed him, Hernan Siles Zuazo, Z-U-A-Z-O, has led a courageous fight against the drug mafia, which continues to hide behind Banzer as their protector. So the GOP entertains a man who soon will be back in power again, as well as other people from drug countries where most of the drug is coming from. I'll take a 1-minute break now and get back on this subject and some other very frightening things. I think they are. This is Mae Brussell, the beginning part 2, side 2 of broadcast number 691, March the 4th, 1985. Just one more thought about Banzer. A subscriber to the tape sent me an article from Washington Report. Bolivia, Banzer eyes the front door. If predictions bear out, the one-time rightist dictator, General Hugo Banzer Suarez, will enter government house, this time through the front door, with ample financial support from rightist business sector in Bolivia and elements of the Republican Party in Florida. Banzer is running a well-heeled media blitz to tout the Nationalist Democratic Party ticket that he needs. Now, that Republican money just didn't come from Florida. It came from the highest levels represented at the Republican Party, the former director of the National Security Council, which is a combination of the CIA, the Defense Department, the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Republican money is putting money into a man who ran these notorious death squads and also works closely with Klaus Barbie, of course, and one of the world's largest cocaine dealers. His opponents charge that he intends to obscure his unsavory record as a murderous dictator from 1971 to 78, a period in which Bolivia's huge cocaine trade flourished, repression ran rampant, death troubles mounted. Former Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie brokered arms deals as a consultant to Banzer's military regime. Klaus Barbie and General Banzer both lived close to each other in Bolivia. Barbie hid under the name Klaus Altman until 1983. To thwart French extradition in 72, Banzer let Barbie 2 uniformed security guards and an official Bolivian passport. Eventually, he was issued an Army ID card that gave him the colonel's rank. As a weapons procurer for the military government, Barbie reportedly arranged a shipment to Bolivia of 100 Austrian light tanks in the mid-1970s. In addition, Barbie collaborated with Banzer in a bizarre scheme to establish 2 new cities in Bolivia's Amazon region by bringing in 30,000 white families from South Africa. The scheme was dropped after Banzer was deposed. Under Banzer, opponents of the military regime frequently met with swift extinction. Media spokesmen, labor leaders were regularly persecuted. Bolivian human rights activists have charged that the regime jailed, tortured, and murdered hundreds of civilians. There is fascism at the GOP entertaining him, buying his time to get the elections down there going. And we'll talk more about buying dictators, about Jesse Helms, in 1 minute. Just to finish up this triumvirate of Mengele, Barbie, and DeLorean, I have so many pieces of news about DeLorean, but I just want to cite a few for them. A while back, not too long ago, there was an article, investors want to see records to find out where his money went, where DeLorean's money went. Then, a long time ago, in 1983, I had on the air, investors accused DeLorean of fraud. This was a $396 million lawsuit, and this is the one that I believe started smoking out mangly because I called the person placing the lawsuit the attorney, and they were looking for that $17 million, a tremendous loss of money, $18.7 million, pardon me, and I mentioned at the time the connections, and I think behind the scenes this is one of the things that began to smoke out Barbie, that they have to find Barbie. August the 20th, 1984, a little less than a year ago, I did a broadcast on the judge that was trying John DeLorean, Judge Robert M. Takasugi. And I made the point on that broadcast that he was appointed to the municipal court by Ronald Reagan, that President Gerald Ford had nominated him to the federal court before that in 1976. This is the Judge Takasugi that sent Larry Flynt to prison and to a mental hospital and charged him $20,000 a day fine for not giving some information about DeLorean. And I also cited that Gordon Novell was put on the payroll of Larry Flynt in his home, along with Mitchell Warbell, that Novell was a friend of DeLorean and planted tapes to Larry Flynt, gave them to him so he would blow the case, that Novell was a suspect in the John Kennedy assassination wanted by Jim Garrison and worked with the World Commerce Corporation that Mr. Bill Donovan of the OSS set up, that Gordon Novell destroyed evidence at the time of Watergate and would have done more if they allowed him, that he was linked to letters to the jury telling them these FBI stings don't work, and had the name and address of the jury, and his name was suspected as being a link. And the judge didn't end the trial because the jury was influenced by letters with a member of Congressman Edwards coming to them as saying just practically blow the case. Well, Judge Takasugi was exposed for what he really is just about a half a year later. You know, sometimes my stories take 2 or 3 years. A long story. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but this is from the Los Angeles Times, February the 10th, 1985. His real estate deals prove embarrassing to the United States judge. In an interview with U.S. District Judge Robert M. Takasugi, he was told of a foreclosure procedure involving his business associate. The judge said the signature on a land record bore his sign named. He tried to deny that. And this has to do, just to show you when the trial was going on, how the story breaks. While preparing to preside over the John DeLorean drug trafficking trial, U.S. District Judge Robert Takasugi got word that he might have to stand trial himself. Now, isn't that cute? He's under investigation. He's been appointed by Reagan and Ford. He's using Gordon Novell, who works with Reagan and Ford, to blow the trial, to let DeLorean off. They had to let DeLorean off. Maybe he would talk if it wasn't off. And this long article is about a business relationship he's had with a man over a period of years, a 20-year business relationship with a man named J. Marshall Uribe. And the article says, whose reputation is as bad as Takasugi's is good. And they buy homes. They began this relationship of buying homes for people and getting into various frauds, having them fixing up the houses and having people in them and defrauding them of money and maintaining a real conspiracy against some very large number of poor people and dealing them a raw break in Los Angeles. And these men met as far back as 1960. The article says Takasugi met Uribe in 1960 when he was practicing law in East Los Angeles, and he represented Uribe at a series of disciplinary hearings held at the State Department of Real Estate, of which Uribe was in trouble. Uribe had proposed a house swap with a client, took the client's home, promptly encumbered it with mortgage loans, sold his own house to someone else, and he has a cycle of problems. Now, this judge represented a man who was under questionable behavior at the time he met him and becomes his business partner, works himself up, appointed a judge by Gerald Ford, then a larger federal position by Ronald Reagan, and he tries John DeLorean, who's tangled with that other can of worms. Someday I'll give you the details on that trial, but I don't want to just emphasize the trial now. I want to go to more. Now, January 21st, just a month and a half ago, 1985, the Washington Post has a story on DeLorean's friend, criminal contempt charges imposed. A female financier from Virginia Hunt Country who once offered to bail out the DeLorean Motors was going to prison for 5 months for criminal contempt. she has assets down in Curacao, a tax haven in the Dutch-ruled Caribbean islands, also known as the Netherlands Antilles, and is wanted for all kinds of investigations of financial acceptance of fees, raising loans for people, and working in a money transfer operation, real estate and money transfer operation. And at the time DeLorean was in trouble, she claimed to have helped put up $10 million as part of a package to rescue his company, and she forwarded the final loan documents on the morning of October 19th, 1982, the last day that the company could hold itself together. But instead of signing the agreement, DeLorean had boarded the airplane for Los Angeles and was arrested, charged with conspiring to arrange a $10 million cocaine deal. So she was going to give him $10 million, send that down to him the same day that he's going to arrange $10 million to get cocaine in Los Angeles. The Sunday London Times has a huge front page story, February 17th, 1985. DeLorean auditors sued for £245 million. I don't know what the pound is worth now. Let's say each pound's worth $1 and not like at 5 it used to be. But on financial irregularities, they're trying to squeeze out where his money went. And again, would it have gone into the account of Joseph Mengele in Zurich, Switzerland? They keep searching it. They can sue him for $100 million. But the answer will be in that, I believe, in that Swiss account in Switzerland, because the sources of my information are very accurate. As a matter of fact, I talked to one of the gentlemen this week who had given me this information and worked on it for a long, long time, and he also told me that the fellow that worked with Mengele down in South America and Klaus Barbie, you had to call somebody on the telephone, and his name is Mr. Von Oven, which is typical. And Mr. Von Oven was the press secretary of Joseph Goebbels and was at the bunker with him up till the very end. I did give that to the Wiesenthal Institute. As long as they don't look for Goebbels' secretary, I was going to look for him. He may not be a war criminal. He just left the bunker. And you can't see Klaus Barbie or talk to Joseph Mengele, or you couldn't talk to Barbie or see either one unless you went through Mr. Von Oven, Wilfred Von Oven. So the DeLorean story is very much in the news. The Barbie story is the Mengele, and I think the three tie together. And then finally on that, there was an interview this week making himself very visible. Howard L. Weitzman, the attorney for DeLorean, who I've talked about many times, he said the legal system works. DeLorean attorney says the acquittal attributed to good lawyering, he calls it, and luck. I think it's attributed to good laundering and luck. That was February the 24th, 1985, where he's bragging about how the system worked and he got DeLorean off. But then 3 days later, the newspaper story comes out and says DeLorean's lawyer gets ranch as pay. So the system really works for him. He got the ranch, and DeLorean didn't get anything so far. I mean, maybe he'll keep it for DeLorean, but that's an interesting connection. Also, I might mention that Mr. Howard Weitzman represented members of the Manson family and the Grandma Mafia that I have brought up before, not too much on the Grandma Mafia, but a member of the Manson family. Well, the Grandma Mafia now links to the cocaine money or the political money of Mr. D'Aubusson and Jesse Helms. We'll get to that in about 1 second. The connections of the men arrested taking the $5.4 million down to El Salvador, linked to Jesse Helms and D'Aubusson. One more thing on DeLorean quickly that I might not have brought up. The Sunday Times, I've had a long time. This is November 84th. Bomb timer man flees after the police blunder. This is a man who was supplying bombs to the Arab terrorists and the Middle East, who works former director manager for Lotus Cars. I don't remember if I mentioned that to you. Lotus Cars were the ones affiliated with the DeLorean motor, and this particular person was responsible for sending these weapons and time bombers and so forth under the guise, say, of the Lotus car along with him or whatever, down to South America. When he was arrested, he walked out, which is typical. Now, here's a news story that you don't have. I got it from Charles Hyam. He said I could put it first on the air because you haven't read it, heard it, seen it. He told me that the well-known Dr. Hermann Friedrich Urban was murdered in Vienna a few weeks ago. It didn't make any news story, although he was very much aware. within a few seconds, he was alerted by people in Vienna. There hasn't been anything in the United States about Dr. Urban. Now, to refresh your memory, going back to 1983, I had a chronology of Dr. Hermann Friedrich Urban, the Nazi who joined the Nazi Party in the Gestapo, then came to San Francisco, was naturalized, and then went around and recruited Gestapo agents. And his name is particularly important because of his role of Errol Flynn, and Errol Flynn working with Ronald Reagan through the year, two movies, 1940 and 42, and the links and associations with Nazis. I think Urban rubbed off in more ways than one on Errol Flynn, but that's not the point. Urban was identified in a chronological order, and I have a sheet that went with that broadcast. If you don't have the tape and just want the sheet, again, write to me because it's a very important chronological order. But in that sheet, I had 1930, Dr. Urban came to the United States and became a citizen. And I've mentioned before my FBI document that the Wiesenthal Center negates. 1932, 2 years later, Mengeles came to the United States and became a citizen. In 1936, Richard Nixon was writing to J. Edgar Hoover and wanting to be in the FBI and wanting to go to the law office of Mr. Donovan and be recruited in whatever Mr. Donovan had to offer in terms of law offices that later became the head of the OSS. But there's a correlation between these people that I'll develop for you later, but Urban is very important. And furthermore, on January the 28th, I shared this information about CBS put on a movie on Errol Flynn, that biography of Errol Flynn. And the broadcasting station, the CBS, according to the New York Times, said that they didn't want to get into politics. The reason they didn't mention Dr. Urban's name, his real name, and used an alias, Jarrett Coates, K-O-E-T-S, is they didn't want to get in politics, even though since the rights to this story had been bought and sold, they wouldn't identify him. And I made a big issue on that particular broadcast this last January, just 5 weeks ago, about Dr. Urban. And in the New York Times, there was an article about Charles Hyam's book on Errol Flynn and the Nazis. It's a very good book. You should really, it's a background book for people studying these conspiracies and matters. Flynn's own book, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, he went to great lengths to cover the name of his benefactor and friend, and he called him Jarrett Coates also. And the CBS film calls him Dr. Coates, but he moves him from Holland to Ireland. And that point is very interesting in this thing that goes across the country, if anybody cared to see it. And then when Charles did his work, he found out that Dr. Coates, identified by Flynn, who wanted to hide it, was actually Dr. Hermann Urban. And that was the gist and a great part of his book on the untold story of Errol Flynn by Charles Hyam. And about it, Rudolf Stober had a comment in the New York Times. This is January the 16th, 1985. By CBS hiding the true identity of one particular character in a docudrama in which all other major characters are called by their correct names, it is not only misleading millions of TV viewers into thinking of Flynn's best friend as a harmless eccentric, it is also debasing the memory of all those who suffered under the Nazis. Now that was January the 16th, 1985. February the 21st, Dr. Urban was dead in Vienna, and the area was marked off as, roped off as if it was a murder. His sister-in-law lives in Vancouver. I have her number, and I might call her and talk to her. Charles Hyam gave me her name. But no next of kin was notified about the death that took place. So New York Times identified Jarrett Keats to an audience that is read more widely in some ways than Charles Hyam's book. The book was it wasn't a bestseller. It was widely read, and it went into a paperback. But there's a different audience from Charles Hyam's book to the New York Times. And when the New York Times printed the controversy of the CBS changing the name, it brought up a couple of issues about Dr. Urban, or why would you not tell his name? What was there to leave out? And then Charles Hyam was interviewed for the New York Times. Now, Urban had been separated. He had a widow, divorced, not maybe legally divorced, but separated. She lives in London. She was not notified of his death. She heard about it 3 weeks later. She went to Vienna. he had quite a lot of money and belongings. There was a question of all the place being not torn apart by a burglary, but fingerprinted, and no information about where that went. And the whole area was surrounded. When she got there, the whole area was surrounded by police and powdered. And so it gave some feeble excuse for the way he died, treated it as a regular natural death, but they marked it off as a homicide. And the people who were writing about Urban, as Rudolf Stober, informed Charles Hyam that he had worked with Urban doing a book, and Urban felt that maybe Stober had betrayed him. Just before the book was to come out, usually it's the author that's killed, this time the main character, but the main carrier was in Hollywood in the era and milieu of Ronald Reagan and Errol Flynn, so you're in a different element. And Stober was about, and he is coming out with the book. Now, after the war, he says there's more about Dr. Urban. One of the things I learned from Charles Hyam is that Urban was involved in one of the largest world arms smuggling ring operations around the world. The locations are in Canada, and some of you researchers might want to go to the library and look this up. It's called the Space Research Corporation. Urban of the Gestapo, he's the fellow that I said was with Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler and the Duke of Duchess of Windsor and Axel Wenner Grand and Errol Flynn's control. WCBH in Boston did a story on nuclear warheads being sent to South Africa to break the Rhodesian arms. Those were arms sent by a Gestapo agent from Vienna and Canada, Dr. Urban. So we'll have to look up this story on the nuclear shipment to South Africa because he was involved in that. Dr. Gerald Ball went to prison for this. That was one of the fellows who was arrested for attempting to ship firearms to South Africa, but Ball's son is a protege of Urban from Vienna. These names don't sound, it's confusing because when it sounds like Ball, it's a good American like George Ball. Gerald Ball went to prison for this shipment. They may be good Americans, but he was a protege of Dr. Urban in Vienna, just as Errol Flynn was a protege of his in Hollywood and worked with him. He put him into medical school, the son of Gerald Ball, who was arrested for the attempt to send these nuclear weapons to South Africa to break up Rhodesia. He went to medical school in Austria, and Dr. Urban had him transferred the entire organization that he had to Austria. Now, interesting enough, among other places, they smuggle weapons going to the Philippines and guns. And when Dr. Urban had his demise in Vienna, his body was sent to the medical school there. His wife wanted to see it, and they told her that it was cut up into various pieces for the anatomy class. He had two sons that joined the Waffen-SS that died during World War II, so this former wife, who lives in London, as I say, was notified 3 weeks later, and he had already been cut up into pieces for the anatomy class. So that's the end of Dr. Urban, and a good job of covering up all these years, thanks to people like Charles Hyam and Mr. Strober in Vienna. The truth will come out, and they'll come closer to some of the people that are in office now than we want to believe, because all the connections of friends and contacts and social places where they all move, the milieu is identical. The most frightening news event I saw this past week was Jesse Helms holding up papers like the Fuhrer, ranting and raving about Dan Rather and CBS, identifying no longer are they communists. He's godless. He's un-American. They can't say they're leftist or socialist. Dan Rather is a non-believer, to paraphrase it, and shaking the papers and calling him by name. It's really scary to see that. And then now Ted Turner comes into the act. On his program, he has such newscasters such as Robert Novak, A Night of Malta with J. Peter Grace and the whole gang. You know what I mean by that. And Tom Buchanan, who is so conservative that he used to attack Reagan for being left. He now works for Ronald Reagan. And Tom Braden is a regular newscaster there, and he was one of the bigwigs into the intelligence community of the CIA in South America. So Ted Turner, these people I don't doubt could raise the funds, and I've mentioned this before. The Miami Herald has a story February the 7th that gives you an idea of how the news would go. It says, funds asked for film on alleged Soviet plot. Jesse Helms, the Republican from North Carolina, said that 3 Soviet labs are involved in the devilish germ warfare plot, that they're trying a horrifying new Soviet weapon, a mixing of flu virus and cobra snake genes. And a letter was circulated by the National Congressional Club's Coalition for Freedom that alleged the Russians were using genetic engineering to create silent, invisible killers. Soviet scientists are creating a new kind of flu, a bacteria, to mix the genes of snakes with common flu, and the result is a new strain that produces paralysis and death. The letter sought $55,000 to start production and $100,000 for TV time. So you can imagine the TV news. When Jesse Helms owns his own station, you'll get the creepies, because that's just a sample of what's going on. And as I say, Tom Braden was past head of the CIA's International Organization Division down in South America, worked for them, and was very much a part of the AFL-CIO group that infiltrated the labor movements, and Ailfield, which was set up in 1962, AILFLD. Those are the letters for the organization under the AFL-CIO that did the spying and counterintelligence that assured or put into power the military dictatorships in South America. The Washington Post has a long story, February 17, 1985. The business section, Wall Street Sharks watch Helms CBS fight. Well, you watch it, but I'll bet he wins it. Now, about Jesse Helms in the news media, there was a convention of the right wing just this last week down, it was in Washington. I thought it was in the South. It was in Washington. And President Reagan was there, and they had booths supporting all their various causes, and Reagan held the freedom fighters down in Nicaragua as being members, brothers, encouraged them to overthrow that country there and compare them to the founding fathers of the United States and brave men and women of the French Revolution. But the important thing was that they had pamphlets and a booth where they, among other things, they were trying to interest people in an area of the press coverage of Grenada. Media Mischief and the Misdeeds was a title of a book, and bumper stickers in praise of the media ban of the United States invasion of Grenada in 1983. That is the first time in the history of America, going way back, that no newspaper accounts could account what was happening down there. And I still think it has allegations of mind control, not Russian, but American. And the convention, and I'm going to go back to that. I will rush through that for 1 minute. But that is media suppression at an official Pentagon level, and they're encouraging it, while Jesse Helms, along with the CIA and the Defense Department and other people, want to buy over the CBS. Now, many of you read the arrest that took place February 16th of the 9 suitcases that had $5.9 million worth of money in $100 bills. D'Aubisson's associate arrested. That is the head of the death squads accused and suggested of ordering the killing of Archbishop Romero. You know who D'Aubisson is. He's close to Western Goals and John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League and Jesse Helms. He had a friend leaving from California, of course, out of Los Angeles, arrested in Florida with this kind of money, $5.9 million, that could be used because an election is coming up, just as the GOP and Richard Allen are throwing the millions into the election down in Bolivia, unlimited money to get their president back, Mr. Banzer, back into office there. Here's $5.8 million, and various articles have suggested that it came from the conservative United States to support, because of elections that would be coming up soon down in El Salvador. Now, Mr. Duarte, the president of El Salvador, told the news media, it was in the Houston Post, I didn't see it in other papers, this came from another friend who religiously sends me 50 or 60 articles dated and clipped every single week from Houston Post. Duarte accuses Jesse Helms of tied to the cash smuggling ring that went down, that was arrested, that was supposed to go down to El Salvador. Senator Jesse Helms challenged President Jose Duarte to prove the allegation that he was responsible for giving this money to this close associate of Mr. D'Aubisson. Mr. Gurriola, who was arrested, is a close associate of the rightist leader, Mr. Roberto D'Aubuisson, who's in jail for $1 million bail in Miami or Corpus Christi, and the president of the country down there, El Salvador, is saying that the money links to Jesse Helms, and the Christian Democrats took out a full-page newspaper saying that the ultra-rightist Jesse Helms was supplying what he wanted, that he was trying to achieve, to pour this money in, achieving his desire, I guess, to affect, he says, the country's electoral processes, that the money is tied down there. Now, Jesse Helms allowed Mr. D'Aubuisson the country. He entertained him. He approves of him. And this is a country where we do not allow the mothers and the families to get a passport. A visa was turned down for the parents of missing children and people to visit this country to speak about human rights. This is a country where up to 50,000 people have been killed in the past 5 years defending their human rights. And the State Department allows Major Roberto D'Aubuisson to be in the company of Jesse Helms and John Sing Laub and the members of Western Goals and entertain in Washington, D.C., keeping one out and the other in, and the Republican Party funding these right-wing death squads. But it comes through a combination of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and the GOP and Jesse Helms. And combined, these elements of fascism, going back to George Bush traveling with Reverend Falwell or Pat Robertson, they all have interconnecting links. The vice president going with them to the death squads, to the terror in Central America, now over the Sudan, traveling around and approving of each other's actions. It's terribly dangerous, and they're tightening the control of the media. Imagine a convention in Washington where those bumper stickers keep the press out of military invasions. What can happen if we do that? And imagine pushing this as being something that is very recognizable and very fine. And time is running out, so I have to hurry now and continue the stories later. Daniel Graham walked out of a conference on the Star Wars because they revealed evidence that it was going to be a first strike attack to start World War III. And Edwin Meese wants a constitutional convention, and the purpose of that, of course, is to make Henry Kissinger president. I'll do the details on those, but the hour is running out. The stories are tremendous, and they all build and tie together to a hypothesis I've had for a long time. This is Mae Brussell. It's Pacific Grove. I'm in Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.